Her tiny hands pressed weakly against the tinted glass, the faint outline of her breath fogging up the window. Inside the locked luxury car, a little girl's cries were barely audible against the hum of the city street. She gasped for air, her cheeks flushed red as the summer heat turned the vehicle into an oven. Just steps away, a maid clawed desperately at the door handles, her knuckles raw, nails tearing as she tried to force them open. Blood trickled from her fingertips, but she didn't stop, and just a few feet behind her, the new wife of the wealthy businessman stood frozen, arms crossed, eyes wide, but not with panic. When bystanders shouted for her to act, her only response was chilling. "I forgot she was in there." Forgot? Or was it something far worse? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories that uncover the hidden truths behind the lives people don't want you to see. It was supposed to be a picture-perfect afternoon in the wealthy suburbs of Connecticut. Expensive cars lined the driveway of a sprawling white mansion. The neighborhood admired the new wife, let's call her Vanessa, for her beauty, her charm, and the way she seemed to fit seamlessly into her husband Richard's world of wealth and influence. To outsiders, she had it all: the house, the jewelry, the lifestyle. But to those living under the same roof, things were not so flawless. Richard's daughter from his first marriage, 8-year-old Grace, often clung to the housemaid, Maria, instead of her stepmother. Grace's mother had passed away years earlier, and while Richard tried to fill the gap with gifts and trips, the bond Grace longed for was one of warmth, not wealth. Vanessa never seemed to notice. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. That afternoon, Richard had rushed to a business meeting, leaving Grace in Vanessa's care. According to Vanessa, she had errands to run, so she buckled Grace into the back seat of her sleek black SUV. But when she pulled into the mansion's driveway hours later, she walked inside with her shopping bags, and without Grace. Inside, Maria noticed Vanessa's distracted demeanor. She asked, "Where's Grace?" But Vanessa brushed past her, muttering something about the child being fine. Moments later, a faint sound reached Maria's ears. It was muffled at first, almost like the squeak of an old gate. Then it grew louder. It was crying. Maria's heart dropped as she rushed outside, following the sound to the car. And there she saw Grace, tiny hands pressed against the glass, tears streaking her face, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through Maria. She screamed for help, clawing at the doors while Vanessa stood still on the steps, silent and unmoved. Richard, the millionaire father, was a man whose name carried weight in the business world. Known for his sharp suits, his philanthropic donations, and his sprawling estate on the edge of town, he appeared to have mastered the art of success. Yet behind the polished image lay a man still grieving. His first wife, the mother of his only daughter, had passed away years earlier, leaving him to balance wealth with the heavy responsibility of single fatherhood. People admired his resilience, but those closest to him saw the quiet sorrow etched into his face whenever his little girl asked about her mother. When Richard remarried, many believed it was his chance to find joy again, to rebuild what tragedy had stolen. But for a man so accustomed to closing deals and calculating risks, he could never have imagined that the greatest threat to his family would come from inside his own home. Vanessa, the new wife, was everything that turned heads in high society. Tall, poised, and dressed in the kind of elegance that seemed effortless, she was introduced at gala dinners and charity auctions as Richard's radiant new bride. To some, she was captivating, her laugh a melody that lit up every room. But to others, especially within the walls of Richard's mansion, her beauty felt like a mask. Whispers among the staff described her as cold, distant, a woman more invested in appearances than in connection. She smiled for cameras, but her eyes rarely softened when she glanced at Grace, the little girl who had lost a mother too soon. Vanessa seemed to play the part of wife perfectly, but stepmotherhood was a role she treated with detachment, as though the child's presence was an inconvenience rather than an inheritance of love. and that distance, unnoticed by Richard, would soon prove dangerous. Grace, just 8 years old, carried innocence in her eyes and loneliness in her heart. With her mother gone, she longed for tenderness, for a figure who would tuck her in at night with stories and hold her hand on the way to school. Richard gave her everything money could buy: toys, tutors, and even vacations in places most children only saw on television. But material gifts could never replace the gentle comfort of a mother's embrace. Around Vanessa, Grace grew quiet, sensing a wall she could never climb over. Yet with Maria, the maid, she was different. Grace clung to her like a second mother, seeking in her warmth what Vanessa never offered. The bond was strong, built not on wealth but on kindness, and it was Maria who noticed every detail: Grace's shy smile, her fears, and now, the silent distance growing between her and her stepmother. Maria had worked for Richard's family long before Vanessa entered their lives. She was loyal, hard-working, and deeply protective of Grace, often stepping in quietly when she noticed what others overlooked. To her, Grace was not just an employer's child, but a girl who deserved love, safety, and attention. Maria's hands were rough from years of labor, yet tender when braiding Grace's hair or wiping away her tears. She noticed the moments of neglect that slipped past Richard, too busy with board meetings, and Vanessa, too consumed by herself. While others might have dismissed her concerns, Maria felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She was determined to guard Grace from harm, even if it meant standing against those far more powerful than herself. And as events unfolded, her vigilance would prove to be the only barrier between a vulnerable child and irreversible tragedy. The mansion itself told 2 stories. To outsiders, it was a palace: gleaming marble floors, sparkling chandeliers, and manicured gardens that whispered of perfection. Inside, however, the cracks showed. Silence often replaced laughter in the halls, and the air carried tension that no wealth could disguise. Richard thought he had built a sanctuary, but his home was becoming a battleground of unspoken resentment and neglect. The stakes were higher than he realized. It was not just the happiness of his new marriage that hung in the balance, it was his daughter's life. In a world where mistakes could be deadly, where negligence could blur into malice, the line between safety and disaster was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. And one day, that line would be crossed, with consequences no fortune on earth could undo. At first, the signs were small, subtle moments that most might dismiss as forgetfulness, but to a child, they were wounds that never healed. Grace would sit at the long oak dining table, waiting for a plate that never came, while Vanessa scrolled through her phone, sipping wine as if dinner were meant only for her. Other times, Grace would tug gently at her stepmother's sleeve, asking for help with her school project, only to be brushed aside with a cold, "Ask Maria, I'm busy." These moments stacked quietly, invisible to Richard, who was often away in meetings or on the phone. He saw smiles in family photos and mistook them for harmony. But Maria, who picked up the uneaten meals and tucked Grace into bed when her stepmother didn't, noticed everything. She said nothing, because in that house, silence was survival. Speaking up might mean losing her job and worse, leaving Grace completely alone. Maria's silence was not born of indifference, but of fear. She had seen the way Vanessa looked at staff who questioned her, sharp, cutting glances that carried unspoken threats. And Maria knew too well how quickly wealthy households could replace a maid, how easily loyalty could be discarded. So she held her tongue, keeping her observations to herself. Richard, blinded by his infatuation, praised Vanessa to everyone. He called her his second chance at happiness, ignoring the moments when Grace clung to Maria's skirt instead of reaching for her stepmother's hand. One evening, Grace whispered to Maria as she was tucked in, "Mommy doesn't like me." The words broke Maria's heart, but she could only stroke the child's hair in silence, praying Richard would one day see what she saw. Suspense hung in the air, because though the warning signs multiplied, no one acted. But one summer afternoon, the truth would break open. Before that afternoon arrived, new questions began to disturb Maria. Why was Vanessa always locking certain doors in the mansion? Rooms that once stood open, like the study and even the guest bedroom, suddenly became off-limits. Maria noticed keys jingling at Vanessa's side, and though she told herself it might be for security, something about it felt unnatural. Grace noticed too. She asked once, in her innocent way, "Why doesn't Mommy let us in that room?" Vanessa's response was icy, a simple, "Because it's none of your business." The words silenced Grace, but her eyes carried confusion and hurt. To Maria, the locks symbolized something hidden, something that didn't belong in a home where trust should live. And with every door Vanessa closed, Maria felt her suspicion grow. But still, she said nothing, afraid of losing the fragile position that allowed her to stay close to Grace. The house glittered on the outside, but secrets were gathering in its shadows. Maria's unease deepened when she began to notice small things in the trash that didn't make sense. Receipts, carefully folded and tucked away, as though Vanessa hadn't meant for them to be found. They weren't for groceries or household items, but for expensive jewelry and designer clothes, far beyond what Richard had openly provided. Maria wondered, was Vanessa hiding purchases from her husband? Or was it something more? She dared not ask. But the discovery gnawed at her. Grace, meanwhile, grew quieter, shrinking into herself whenever her stepmother entered the room. One afternoon, Maria overheard the child whisper again, this time more firmly, "Mommy doesn't like me." The innocence in those words was like a dagger, but Maria could only hold her close, offering the love the girl was denied. And yet, even as Maria resolved to protect her, she knew she was powerless without Richard's eyes finally opening to the truth. Richard's blindness was almost willful. Friends who visited commented on how Vanessa rarely engaged with Grace, how she seemed distracted whenever the child spoke. But Richard brushed it off, insisting that blending families took time. He believed what he wanted to believe, that Vanessa was simply adjusting, that Grace would grow to love her new stepmother. His wealth had insulated him from the struggles of ordinary families, and he saw cracks in his household as nothing more than growing pains. When Maria once hesitated to mention Grace's loneliness, Richard silenced her with a smile. "You're worrying too much," he said. "Vanessa is good for us. You'll see." Maria bit her tongue, knowing the words would change nothing. In that house, truth was invisible to the man who signed the paychecks. But denial has a way of crumbling, and the longer it's ignored, the harsher the fall when reality strikes. And reality was already circling. Vanessa's neglect was no longer subtle. Grace would come home from school, left waiting in the driveway because her stepmother forgot to pick her up. On other days, she skipped meals entirely until Maria quietly slipped her a plate. The girl's once bright laughter dulled into silence, replaced with the kind of weariness that no child should carry. Maria kept watch, but she could not shield Grace from everything. The mansion became a place of unease, where glittering chandeliers masked heavy tension. Every day Maria asked herself how long she could protect the child on her own, and every day the signs grew stronger that something was deeply wrong. Because behind every locked door, every hidden receipt, every neglected need, a truth was building, one that no amount of money or charm could cover forever. And when it finally surfaced, it would shake the household to its core. The morning of the charity gala was painted with luxury. The mansion buzzed with activity as staff polished silverware and florists arranged bouquets for the evening reception. Richard was in his study, rehearsing a speech he would later give to an audience of wealthy donors. For him, the night was about reputation, philanthropy, and being seen as a man who not only built fortunes, but gave them back. Vanessa, however, had her own plan. Draped in a fitted gown, her reflection in the gilded mirror seemed to matter more than the cause of the event. To everyone's surprise, she announced she would take Grace along. "It's important we bond," she said lightly, fastening her necklace. Richard, moved by the gesture, smiled warmly and thanked her. To him, it sounded like progress. But Maria, standing quietly by the doorway, caught a flicker of coldness in Vanessa's eyes, a flicker Richard never seemed to see. The household moved in a flurry. Maria laid out Grace's dress, a pale yellow one with a satin bow, perfect for the photograph she knew Richard would demand. Grace twirled once in front of the mirror, though her smile faltered when Vanessa walked into the room. The stepmother's compliment was hollow, a forced, lovely, before she hurried the girl toward the waiting car. Maria stood by the steps, watching them leave, her hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Something in her chest tightened, but she said nothing. She reminded herself that it wasn't her place, that her duty was service, not interference. Still, as the sleek black SUV rolled down the driveway, the unease lingered. For all of Vanessa's talk about bonding, Maria knew the truth. Grace had never once returned from such outings with stories of joy, only with silence and downcast eyes. Today would be no different, only worse. When the car pulled back into the mansion's driveway hours later, the sun had reached its peak, baking the asphalt until it shimmered with heat. Vanessa stepped out gracefully, adjusting her sunglasses, a few shopping bags in her hand, items she had picked up before the event. But there was no movement from the back seat, no small footsteps, no giggles, not even the soft voice of a child asking to be let out. Vanessa walked into the house without looking back, her heels clicking on the marble floor as though she carried no burden of responsibility. Maria, busy in the kitchen, assumed Grace had gone upstairs with her, yet something tugged at her mind, a silence too heavy for a child's return. It wasn't until much later, when the sound reached her ears, that Maria's heart dropped. A faint cry, weak, muffled, almost invisible against the hum of the afternoon. Maria froze, straining to hear again. The sound came not from the hall, nor the staircase, but from outside. She rushed to the window, peering toward the driveway, and there she saw it, the tiny figure in the back seat. Grace's hands pounding against the tinted glass, her mouth open in silent screams. Maria's breath caught as she raced outside, the air heavy with the suffocating heat. By the time she reached the car, Grace's face was red, her hair clinging to her damp forehead, her little fists striking desperately against the window. The door handles seared under Maria's grip, locked and unyielding. She screamed for Vanessa, but there was no answer. Panic surged in her chest as Grace's cries weakened. The girl gasped, fogging the glass, each breath more labored than the last. Maria clawed at the door until her nails split, blood smearing against the polished paint. Still, the car remained sealed. Every second felt like an eternity. The heat inside the vehicle climbed higher, turning the leather seats into an unbearable furnace. Grace slumped forward, her small palms sliding weakly against the window, her energy draining. Maria's heart pounded as she looked around desperately, hoping someone, anyone, would come. But the mansion grounds were empty, the staff scattered with their tasks, Richard away at his meeting, and Vanessa nowhere to be seen. Maria screamed again, her voice breaking, but only the cicadas in the distance answered her. She was alone, her hands trembling on the glass, knowing that if she didn't act soon, Grace's life would slip away before her eyes. Yet another thought gripped her, a cruel reality. Breaking into Richard's car without permission could mean losing her job, being cast out of the only life she had built. And if Vanessa framed her, she could lose far more than her livelihood. Tears blurred Maria's vision as she pressed her forehead to the glass, whispering words of comfort Grace could not hear. The child's lips trembled, forming shapes that Maria recognized. "Help me." With her hands shaking, Maria weighed the impossible choice. Obey the silence of wealth, protect her position, and watch Grace fade away, or risk everything, shatter the trust of the household, and save the life of the little girl she loved like her own. Her pulse raced, every muscle in her body screaming for action, yet the fear of what would come after loomed just as large. And so she stood, torn between survival and sacrifice, her bleeding hands resting against the locked door. At that moment, the story balanced on a knife's edge. The cries were fading, The heat was rising, and the question that hung in the air was clear. Would Maria dare to break the unbreakable? In that unbearable heat, with Grace slipping closer to unconsciousness, Maria's fear gave way to something stronger. Desperation. She pulled off her apron, wrapped it around her hand, and with a cry that tore from the depths of her soul, she smashed it against the glass. The first blow cut her skin, shards biting into her palm. Blood streaked across the window, but she struck again, ignoring the pain. On the third attempt, the glass finally shattered, sending splinters scattering across the driveway. With trembling arms, she reached inside, unbuckling the child and dragging her out onto the scorching pavement. Grace gasped for air, coughing, her tiny chest heaving as life clung to her fragile frame. Maria cradled her, tears mingling with sweat and blood, whispering over and over, "You're safe now. You're safe." For a brief moment, relief washed over her, but in that mansion, relief never lasted long. The sound of shattering glass drew Vanessa from inside the house. She appeared on the steps, her designer heels clicking sharply, her expression carefully composed. Then, as if on cue, her hands flew to her mouth. "Oh my God!" she cried out, her voice carrying the perfect note of horror. "I forgot she was there." The words echoed across the driveway, a performance meant for anyone who might be listening. To most, it might have sounded like shock. To Maria, still clutching Grace's trembling body, it felt hollow, too rehearsed, too convenient. Vanessa crouched beside them, stroking Grace's damp hair with hands that had shown no affection before. The contrast was unbearable. Maria stared at her, blood dripping from her hands, and a question carved itself into her heart. How could a mother, real or step, forget a child locked in a car under the blazing summer sun? Something about it felt off. Terribly off. Maria said nothing. She couldn't. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to steady Grace, who clung weakly to her shoulder. Vanessa's performance continued, her voice rising in practiced anguish as she repeated, "I can't believe I forgot. I can't believe I did this." But Maria's instincts screamed otherwise. The receipts in the trash, the locked doors, the indifference that had marked every interaction, none of it aligned with the story of an innocent mistake. Her gaze burned into Vanessa, who avoided her eyes, focusing instead on how she looked in the moment of crisis. Maria's suspicion grew heavier with every heartbeat. This was no simple lapse of memory. This was something darker. And as Grace whimpered softly against her chest, Maria knew the danger was not over. It was only beginning. Word of the incident reached Richard quickly. He arrived home in a rush, his tie loosened, his face pale as he leapt from his car and sprinted toward the driveway. He fell to his knees beside his daughter, scooping her into his arms with trembling hands. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered her name over and over, kissing her damp forehead, thanking God she was still alive. Then his gaze shifted to Maria, whose hands dripped crimson from the shattered glass. Gratitude shone in his eyes. She had saved his child. But when he turned to Vanessa, who clung to him with tearful apologies, his heart twisted. He wanted to believe his wife. He wanted to see her as a woman capable of mistakes, not malice. Torn between the maid who had proven her loyalty with blood and the wife who swore it was all an accident, Richard stood frozen at the crossroads of trust and truth. The incident did not stay contained to the mansion. Within days, whispers spread quietly among the staff and distant relatives who heard fragments of the story. Some said it was an unfortunate mistake, the kind anyone could make in a distracted moment, but others lowered their voices, leaning closer to ask the question no one dared say aloud. Was it really an accident? The thought lingered like a shadow, creeping through the grand halls of Richard's estate. Every glance Vanessa cast toward Grace seemed too measured, every apology too carefully delivered. Maria, still nursing the cuts on her hands, carried her suspicions in silence, torn between duty and conscience. But deep inside, she knew the truth would not stay hidden forever. The walls of wealth could muffle the sound of gossip, but they could not silence the echoes of doubt, and those echoes were growing louder by the day. It was Maria who stumbled upon the first crack in Vanessa's story. Cleaning one evening, she passed by the study and noticed Vanessa's phone left unattended on the desk. A screen still open displayed a chilling search history. How long can a child survive in a hot car? Maria's heart pounded as she read it, her breath catching in her throat. The words alone were enough to twist her stomach into knots. Was this mere curiosity or planning? She quickly locked the screen and slipped away before Vanessa could return, but the discovery haunted her. That night, as Grace slept soundly, Maria lay awake replaying the moment in her mind. She wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was coincidence, but she couldn't. The pieces were aligning too neatly, and what they painted was not the picture of a forgetful woman. It was the image of something far more deliberate. Her unease deepened when she later found documents tucked away in Vanessa's desk drawer, insurance policies, freshly updated, with Grace's name woven into the details. The coverage had grown alarmingly large in recent weeks, a fact Maria could not ignore. She knew she had no right to pry, but the signatures stared back at her like silent witnesses. Combined with the chilling search on the phone, the narrative of forgetfulness unraveled before her eyes. Maria tried to bring her concerns to Richard once, hesitating at the kitchen doorway as he poured himself a drink. But his reaction was predictable. He waved her off with weary affection, insisting Vanessa loved Grace, insisting that grief and adjustment explained her flaws. His love for his wife was a shield, one so thick that no fact seemed able to pierce it. Maria walked away that night knowing that love, blind as it was, could be fatal. And yet the questions continued to pile. Strange phone calls echoed through the mansion late at night, Vanessa's voice lowered to a whisper as she slipped into locked rooms. Maria overheard fragments, names she did not recognize, promises made in hushed tones. Once, she caught Vanessa smiling in a way she had never seen around Grace or Richard, a softness reserved for someone else entirely. Who was the man on the other end of the line? Why the secrecy? Maria pieced together the signs in silence, her heart racing with the implications. If Vanessa's neglect was not carelessness but calculation, then Grace's life hung by a thread, balanced against motives Maria could scarcely imagine. And still, Richard clung to love, defending his wife even as doubt crept into his eyes. Between loyalty and betrayal, accident and intent, the truth lay hidden in the gray, and Maria feared it would surface only in tragedy. One evening, Maria's suspicions reached their breaking point. She moved quietly through the corridors, a phone tucked into her apron pocket, recording as she passed the closed study door. Inside, Vanessa's voice trembled with fury, words spilling in sharp whispers. "I never wanted that child. She's not mine. She ruins everything. Once she's gone, Richard will finally see me, and only me." Maria froze, her blood running cold. There it was, not neglect, not forgetfulness, but intent. Each word seared into the recording, undeniable, irreversible. For weeks Maria had doubted herself, questioned if grief had clouded her judgment. But now the truth was captured, raw and damning. The little girl was never safe in Vanessa's care. She was never meant to be. When Richard heard the recording later that night, his world cracked open. At first, he refused to believe it, shaking his head, muttering excuses. But the words of the woman he had married sliced through every defense. Vanessa's voice, so familiar, now carried a venom he had been too blind to see. "I never wanted that child." The man who built an empire, who negotiated billion-dollar deals, stood powerless in his own home, betrayed where it mattered most. Confrontation erupted in the grand hall, voices echoing off marble walls. Richard demanded answers, but Vanessa only spun lies, tears spilling as she begged him to see reason. Yet every denial rang hollow, every excuse crumbled beneath the weight of the truth. Love had shielded him for too long, but now love was the knife in his chest. And in the middle of the storm stood Grace. Her small frame trembled as she clung to Maria, eyes wide with fear as shouts thundered overhead. She buried her face into the maid's apron, whispering words that shattered everyone in the room. "Mama, please don't leave me." Maria froze, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hands wrapping protectively around the child. In that instant, the bonds of blood meant nothing. Love, loyalty, and sacrifice defined family more than any last name or title. Richard watched, torn between heartbreak and clarity, realizing that the woman who saved his daughter was not the one he had vowed his life to, but the one he had hired, underestimated, and nearly overlooked. The truth was revealed, and it could never be buried again. In the weeks that followed, Richard made a choice that shook not only his household, but the entire community that once admired his marriage. The recording was undeniable. Vanessa's words spread like wildfire, whispered among relatives, splashed across tabloids, and dissected in courtrooms. What began as admiration for a glamorous wife collapsed into scandal, disgrace, and divorce. Her fall from grace was swift and merciless. The doors of luxury that once opened for her now slammed shut, and the respect she had carefully crafted vanished overnight. But for Richard, the public humiliation was nothing compared to the betrayal that had unfolded under his own roof. He had been deceived in the one place he thought he was safest, his home. Through it all, Maria remained steadfast. Not only did Richard reward her financially for saving his daughter's life, but he also entrusted her with something far more valuable: his child's heart. Grace no longer looked at Maria as just the maid. She was family. Nights once haunted by nightmares slowly gave way to quiet moments of safety as Grace nestled against Maria's shoulder, knowing she would never be forgotten again. For Richard, it was humbling. All the wealth he had built, all the power he had wielded, could not protect his daughter. Yet the loyalty of one overlooked woman had. Time began to heal what betrayal had fractured. Grace carried scars of fear, but she also carried the love of someone who proved that true family is not defined by titles or appearances. And for viewers like us, the story leaves a haunting question. Do you believe Vanessa truly forgot her stepdaughter in that sweltering car? Or was it something darker, something intentional? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Wealth can buy comfort, but it cannot buy loyalty. Sometimes the truest protector is the one society overlooks. If this story moved you, hit the like button. It helps us reach more people who need to hear stories like this. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories every single week.